kind old mariner. Old Peter had been a sailor who had voyaged to many foreign lands in his youth, but he was now too old to go to sea. He lived alone in a little cottage just beyond the village and seldom spoke to anyone. There was a reason for his strange, quiet behavior. Some years before, he had lived very happily with his wife and daughter, but a deadly fever which had swept through the village had carried them both away and left him desolate. Peter had mourned his great loss ever since, and had grown sadder and more silent as the years went by. The old mariner, like most sailors, was very tidy in his habits and kept his house as clean as a new pin. Sometimes, however, he suffered from severe pains in his legs and could not go about to dust and clean his furniture as he would have liked. Naturally, this vexed him greatly, and he could never make up his mind to have a housekeeper. One very stormy evening, while the sea roared loudly against the rocky coast, old Peter closed his shutters, lit the lamp, looked round his cozy room. A warm, bright fire burned in the hearth, and his supper was on the table, but the old man shuddered as he thought of the poor souls at sea in such terrible weather. Suddenly he heard a sound of sobbing outside, followed by these words, spoken in a coarse and angry voice. "Go away, you little hussy! Go away, I tell you! I cannot afford to keep you any longer. Go and beg for your living. You are not the first one who has done so." Then followed the rumbling noise of a cart as it moved away. The sobs grew louder and appeared to come from someone quite close to the cottage. The old man took the lamp in his hand, opened the door cautiously. Crouching on the step with a little girl about 11 years of age. Crouching on the step was a little girl about 11 years of age. She shivered with cold and seemed quite drenched with the rain. Her clothes, which had once been brightly colored, were faded and torn. Even under the feeble light of the lamp, the old mariner could see that she was very pale and tired. "What do you want?" asked the old sailor in a gruff yet kind voice. The little girl raised her head, and he saw that her eyes were brimming with tears as she replied, "My master has turned me away, and I have nowhere to go." "Who is your master?" inquired the old mariner. "My master is a traveling showman. He performs at the fairs. I helped him as much as I could, but I am afraid I was too young to be of much service to him. He said that he could not afford to keep me, and so he has sent me away." "Have you no parents?" asked the old man. "No, I am an orphan." "And what will you do now?" "I don't know. I have no home, no friends, nowhere to go." She timidly raised her eyes to the old man's face, and as he looked at her, his heart softened. Then he said to himself, She is very like my own girl. I would be cruel and wicked to leave her outside on such a night as this." Stepping aside to allow her to enter, he said, "Come in. You may stay here until tomorrow morning." The child needed no second bidding, and in a few moments he was seated at the table and enjoying a hearty supper. No sooner had she finished than, worn out and tired, she lay down on the couch and fell fast asleep. The old man, however, had little rest that night with his pains, and by next morning he had quite forgotten about his little guest. Imagine his surprise when he rose to find the little girl bustling about her sitting room as lively as a bird. Her newly washed face was bright and charming, and she sang to herself as, broom in hand, she put the room in order. Old Peter smiled with pleasure and said, "Just continue with what you are doing while I go shopping." He took a basket and went off to the village store to buy some provisions. When the old mariner returned, he found her seated at the window mending the frayed coverlet of his bed. The house was in perfect order, and the dishes on the dresser racks shone like silver. A little later, having finished all that there was to do, she rose humbly and said, "I must go now." "Go?" exclaimed old Peter. "Why should you go? You said last night that I might stay till morning, and it is now noon." The old man took her by the hand. "Stay here," he said, "and be my little housekeeper. I am too poor to pay you well, but at least you will have a home and plenty to eat." Her only reply was to throw her arms around him. In spite of his rough manner, old Peter had a warm, kind heart, and the lonely girl's action brought a lump to his throat. Enough, enough, he said, putting her away gently. The same afternoon they sat together on a seat in the cottage garden. The storm had passed, and the sun shone brightly in a clear blue sky. Old Peter smoked his pipe while the girl sewed a new dress for herself. All at once she said, "You must have seen many strange and interesting sights in the distant lands to which you have travelled. Please tell me about them." She could not have found a better way of reaching the old man's heart. He laughed with pleasure and told her an exciting tale of one of his early voyages. Each day when supper was over, she would ask him to tell her about his life abroad, and with his gleaming eye and outstretched hand, he would pass from one thrilling adventure to another. The old mariner told her of the foreign lands he had visited, the people he had seen, and the houses in which they lived. The little orphan listened with beating heart as he described the American Indians and their wigwams, the Zulus and their kraals, the Inuits and their igloos, and many other people who lived in strange kinds of homes. When the first month had passed, old Peter offered her payment for her work as housekeeper. To his surprise, she pushed the money away and refused to accept it. "How can you think," she said in a broken voice, "that I could take wages from you who saved me from want and cold?" A gleam of tenderness lit the old man's face. He held out his arms to her, and she, with a soft, glad cry, hid her face in his broad bosom. "From now on you are my daughter," he said. "You will call me father, and you will take the place of my own little girl who died." As time passed, the two were so happy that the good people of the village said one would scarcely know old Peter. He had become so friendly and cheerful since the little girl came to stay with him. Interesting facts about the dwellings of man. There was time long ago when men did not build houses in which to live. Their homes were caves and wide burrows or holes in the earth. They usually chose the sides of hills, and this allowed them to cluster together. There they found shelter from the sun, the wind, and the rain. These people lived almost like wild animals, which they hunted to provide themselves with food and clothing. In countries where canes and long grasses grew in abundance, the natives made huts by weaving reeds and hanging woven mats from poles. In some parts of the world, these huts were built in the trees. These tree huts or nest-like houses were erected to provide protection from wild animals and unfriendly tribes and ground flooding. In countries where long grasses were not so plentiful, the dried skins of animals were used as a covering, and thus tent-like houses, such as the tepee and the wigwam, were built. They could, in times of danger and want, be easily taken down and put up again at another chosen spot. In the far north, where the cold was intense and a thick solid shelter was needed, the Inuits or the Eskimos built igloos. These huts were made of blocks of frozen snow and shaped like beehives. Gradually, men began to use materials such as mud and earth to make their houses. They erected walls of clay which were left to dry in the heat of the sun. When the walls would become firm and dry, a cover of leaves or grass would be placed on top to form a roof. In some far eastern countries, a great number of people have dwellings which are actually afloat. On Chinese rivers, one might see a whole village of wooden huts built on a huge raft of logs, or a large cluster of boats especially built to be used as houses, tied together to form a floating town. It was not until men were able to use tools that they began to make big solid houses. In places near forests, log cabins and timber houses were built. Their chief drawback was the danger of catching fire. A great advance in building was made when clay bricks, which had been hardened in furnaces, were used. Most homes are now built of bricks or concrete blocks, although some are timber framed with brick on the outside. This allows them to be built very quickly. Stone is the best and the most enduring of all building materials. When men learned to quarry and to shape stones, to fix them together with mortar, and to adorn them with carving, many noble and beautiful buildings were erected. Nowadays, when so much depends on saving time, room, and labor, houses of many floors or stories are erected. They are built on a framework of steel with walls of stones, concrete, and even glass. Very tall buildings are called skyscrapers. Burj Khalifa, the tallest building in the world situated in Dubai, has as many as 163 floors. What was the sailor's name? The sailor's name was Peter. He was not a sailor anymore. Why? This was because he had grown too old to go to sea. Where did he live? He lived alone in a little cottage just beyond the village. What was the reason for his strange and quiet behavior? The reason for his strange and quiet behavior was that he was lonely and desolate. His wife and daughter died of an illness a few years ago. Like most sailors, he'd dash. Like most sailors, he liked to keep tidy. He liked to keep his house as clean as a new pin. From what illness did he sometimes suffer? He suffered from severe pains in his legs, and he could not go about cleaning his house as he used to. What did he do on that stormy night? On that stormy night, Peter closed his shutters, lit the lamp, looked around his cozy room. A warm, bright fire burned in the hearth, and his supper was on the table, but he shuddered to think of what was to become of the poor souls on a night as this. Suddenly he heard the sound of someone sobbing outside, and to her were spoken these words, which were very harsh and cruel. "Go away, you little hussy, go away, I tell you. I cannot afford to keep you any longer. Go and beg for your living. You are not the first one who has done so." And then he heard a cart move away, while the sobbing became nearer. He opened the door cautiously, and he found a little girl about the age of 11 years crying at the door. She was cold and pale, and her clothes had been faded and torn. What did the old man say when he heard her sad story? When he heard her sad story, he asked her to come in for the night and stay until the morning. Where did she sleep that night? She lay down on the couch and fell fast asleep after a hearty supper. What surprise did he receive when he awoke the next morning? When the sailor awoke the next morning, he found the little girl bustling about his sitting room as lively as a bird. Her newly washed face was bright and charming, and she sang to herself, broom in hand, as she put the room in order. Where did he go? He went to the village store to buy provisions. On his return, how did he pass the afternoon? When he returned, he found her seated at the window, mending the frayed coverlet of his bed. The house was in perfect order, and the dishes on the dresser racks shone like silver. What offer did the old mariner make to her at the end of the month? The old man wanted to make her his housekeeper for a small amount of wages, home, and food. What answer did she give? She said she couldn't take any money from him because he had saved her life that cold night. What did the village people say about old Peter? The village people said one would scarcely recognize old Peter because he had become so friendly and cheerful since the little girl had come to stay with him. Questions about interesting facts. What kinds of homes had men before they built houses? People used to live in burrows on the sides of the hills. They lived in tree huts. They lived in teepees, wigwams, igloos, and walls of clay. What kinds of houses were built in lands where canes and long grasses grew? People would make houses of tree huts or nest-like houses. to provide protection from wild animals, unfriendly tribes, and flooding. Why did some people build their houses in the trees? They built their houses in the trees to protect themselves from wild animals, unfriendly tribes, and ground flooding. Describe the building of a teepee or a wigwam. They were tent-like houses, which could, in times of danger and want, be easily taken down and put up again at another chosen spot. It was made of the dried skins of animals. How was an igloo made and who lived in them? An igloo was made with blocks of frozen snow way up in the North Pole. This was by the Eskimos or the Inuits. A mixture of mud and earth was used to build walls. Describe a house made in this way. Mud and earth used to be made into houses. They erected walls of clay which were left to dry in the heat of the sun, and when the walls would become firm and dry, a cover of leaves or grass would be placed on top to form a roof. In some countries, a great number of people live afloat. Tell of 2 ways in which this was done. In some Far Eastern countries, people lived on the rivers. They made their wooden huts on huge rafts of logs or a large cluster of boats just to stay afloat. They were built as houses and tied together to form a floating town.